All right, well, our guest tonight is Shadow Assistant Treasurer Matthias Cormann. He's predicted the mining tax will eventually be thrown out by the High Court. Senator Cormann, thanks very much for joining us on The Drum tonight.
Good to be here. Good evening to everyone.
Now, before we get to the mining tax, what did you make of Clive Palmer's comments today that the CIA is behind a Greens campaign to kill the coal mining industry in Australia and make American coal more competitive?
Well, I got to say I haven't seen Clive Palmer's comments in detail today. I've been talking to my friends in the media all day about the mining tax, and I've sort of been in and out of the Senate. So rather than to make an uninformed comment in relation to something that I haven't actually directly seen, I'd sort of just rather not comment.
Well, I've just told you what his comments were. You're not willing to trust me on that one, Matthias?
On the face of it, it sounds out there, but I mean, obviously, I don't really know where he's coming from.
Okay, I mean, he does donate a lot of money to the coalition. I think in 1 year he donated nationally about $1 million to the coalition. Is that somebody that you're comfortable being that strongly associated with the coalition?
Well, let me just make this point. I mean, I don't know Clive Palmer personally all that well, but I have visited one of his companies, Queensland Nickel, out on the outskirts of Townsville. That was a company that used to be part of the BHP family, and it was about to go under, and 1,000 people were about to lose their jobs. And Clive Palmer walked in and he turned the situation around. He made that a profitable company, and 1,000 employees still have their jobs, and their families still have, of course, the benefit of that the biggest private sector employer in the Townsville area going strong. So, I mean, I think that Clive Palmer does a lot of, good things. He does a lot of great things. In fact, he clearly is a colourful character. He clearly speaks his mind. But in relation to these matters, I just rather let Clive Palmer talk for himself.
Okay, let's talk about the mining tax. You've been quoted today as saying that you think it'll be thrown out in the High Court. What makes you think that?
Well, I mean, the Gillard government is a government that is very incompetent. It's highly dysfunctional. It's a government that doesn't do its homework. And you've got to remember the circumstances in which the RSPT became the Mineral Resource Rent Tax. We lost the Prime Minister. Julia Gillard, as the new Prime Minister, was desperate to do a deal. She did it very quickly. She sat down with the three managing directors of the three biggest mining companies, excluding all of their competitors, excluding state and territory governments from the process, and she never sought advice on the constitutional validity of the MRRT the way it was structured. Now, on the fight, the government will argue that this is a tax on mining profits, on profits. I would say that because it is imposed at the point of extraction, there is very little value in the resource, and there certainly is no profit. The government has come up with this artificial construct of profit at the point of extraction. There is a clear argument that at the point of extraction the resource is the property of the state, and Section 114 of the Constitution prohibits a federal tax on the property of states, and of course on that basis, if the High Court were to find along those ways, on that ground alone, the mining tax, Labor's dodgy and highly complex mining tax would be thrown out.
Okay, so just to clarify, you think it's unconstitutional because minerals come from the state, and therefore you think they're taxing the minerals rather than taxing the super profits. Is that right?
Well, minerals are manifestly the property of states, and my argument is that the Labor Party mining tax is a tax on state property. Now, the Constitution prohibits a federal tax on state property. Now, that is one argument. There is also another argument, and that relates to Sections 51 and 99 of the Constitution, which prohibit discrimination between states. And certainly, I mean, there is a clear case on the face of it that needs to be settled in the High Court. Now, the point I would make, though...
But just to take you up on that point, doesn't there need to be discrimination at the tax rate? And the tax rate would be the same amongst all the states.
Well, I mean, the government has because the government didn't do its homework, because they didn't sit down with the states. I mean, the Henry Tax Review recommended a national profit-based tax to replace state and territory royalties. Now, the federal government never even tried to talk to the states about this, so instead they came up with this very complicated workaround. They are crediting all state and territory royalties against the resource rent tax liability. And of course, those state royalties are at different levels in different states, and there are very serious questions now as to whether there is preferential state treatment of some states, where companies in those states will benefit from more generous crediting arrangements because of the way the royalty arrangements are structured. Now, but I mean, ultimately, this is something that will have to be, the toss will have to be argued by the lawyers in the High Court. But there's two areas.
Okay.
There's a clear suggestion that this could be a federal tax on state property, and there's a clear question as to whether this discriminates between states.
All right, let's move on to another part of your argument, and that's that you think the mining tax, and the Coalition argues that the mining tax will drive investment offshore. Now, according to the Australian Mines and Metals Association, and this is from their own submission last month to the Fair Work Act review, there's $316 billion worth of approved resource projects in the pipeline that are either committed or under construction, and there's a further $307 billion worth of projects awaiting approval. That doesn't sound like investments are going offshore in a hurry.
Well, I mean, it's no secret that right now the mining industry is doing well. I mean, the mining industry right now is doing well, and the government wants to hit them with a massive new tax to slow them down. And of course, like the argument that we would be putting is you don't improve our economic prospects, you don't improve our economic wealth and prosperity moving forward by trying to slow down the sector that just happens to be in the fast lane right now. What we ought to be doing is to put the policy settings in place that actually helps those sectors of the economy that are not doing so well right now to speed up. And of course, the first thing the government should do in that regard is to scrap the carbon tax, which
but those projects I referred to,
our international competitiveness.
But those projects I referred to, those hundreds of billions of dollars worth of projects, they're in the pipeline now. If the mining industry thought that this tax was going to move everything offshore, then surely they would not even have those projects in the pipeline.
Well, we should not be taking the mining industry for granted. There is no doubt that, based on the taxation arrangements that have been in place for the last 40 years, the mining industry in Australia is in a position where they're now doing very well. And clearly, global conditions, commodity prices, and so on, we've got the best terms of trade in 140 years. That will not necessarily last forever. And you can't set up a taxation regime chasing whatever sector of the economy happens to do well at this point in time, and then sort of think that is going to be a sustainable basis to try and lift up everybody else. Okay. The best way to lift manufacturing is to scrap the carbon tax.
All right, we already have a resource rent tax on petroleum in this country. It was introduced back in 1986, and it's higher than the mining tax. Can you point to examples of that tax driving investment offshore?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, the petroleum resource rent tax was introduced in 1987 or thereabouts, and of course it only applies in offshore, in Commonwealth waters. There's no state royalty regime there, whereas onshore, of course, the mineral resource rent tax, rather than being a replacement tax, as was recommended by the Henry Tax Review, is a top-up tax. It comes on top of state royalties and on top of company tax. Now, the petroleum resource rent tax, the important point to make here too is that there is not a single project that has come on stream in the last 25 years that would now, today, be paying the petroleum resource rent tax. It is my understanding that the only project that pays the petroleum resource rent tax offshore right now is the project in the Bass Strait, which was moved into that arrangement by the Hawke government back in 1987 or thereabouts, could have been 1990 or something.
Okay.
And they've been in the courts, incidentally, ever since, fighting the toss about what should be in and what shouldn't be in.
All right, I want to throw to Catherine Murphy now, who's got a question. Catherine?
Yes, Senator Cormann, I was struck by Ross's description earlier of Tony Abbott's paid parental leave scheme as giving the girls a go. Would you agree with that characterisation of Mr Abbott's scheme, and are you a fan of it in its current form?
Well, I mean, our paid parental leave scheme is a very economic and social reform. It is good for women, clearly, it's good for families, and it's good for the economy. It deals with the three most significant economic challenges that we face as a nation right now: population, productivity, and workforce participation. If you look at the intergenerational report, I mean, it's there for all to see, the sorts of challenges that we face in those areas, and clearly a proper and fair dinkum paid parental leave scheme is going to be a very important part of our economic reform agenda in government.
You'd concede, though, presumably, that it does make your capacity to deliver business tax cuts that much more complicated if you're also trying to achieve a surplus?
Well, we will be delivering a surplus, and obviously, I mean, in government, as you go through a budget and as you put a budget together, it is always a matter of making judgments on competing priorities. The introduction of the paid parental leave scheme is a very high priority for us. Well, in fact, it is a clear-cut commitment that we will deliver on. And of course, in that context, I mean, we are currently going through a very methodical process through the Shadow Ministry Expenditure Review Committee. We're going through the budget line by line, cutting out labour waste, and we are very confident that we can deliver on the paid parental leave scheme, that we can deliver a modest company tax cut, and that we can deliver budget surpluses. I mean, just look at our track record. We had a track record of budget surplus after budget surplus. Wayne Swan has delivered $167 billion worth of accumulated deficits.
Okay, one last question from Reece. Reece?
Yeah, Matthias, I'm just wanted to talk to you. I was speaking to Twiggy Forrest today about the mining tax, and like you, he's not happy with it, but for quite different reasons. For example, he feels that the big three miners are being let off way too much tax. He feels that the 40% and spending money on infrastructure is closer to the mark. And I'm just wondering, what you would say to Twiggy Forrest's thoughts. He feels that it's not often you hear a billionaire saying, I should be paying more tax, but he's one of them.
Well, I mean, I have obviously, I mean, there's a lot of flaws in this tax, and in the 5 minutes we've got, we can't go through all of them. But I refer you to the two Senate mining tax inquiry reports that I've delivered, and clearly there is a fundamental flaw in the way this mining tax was negotiated by the Prime Minister. In fact, I would go as far as to say it is an absolute national disgrace the way the Prime Minister and the Treasurer negotiated the design of a new tax exclusively and in secret with the three biggest mining companies, and designing it in a way that gives them an unfair competitive advantage, making it harder for the smaller and newer projects to compete and to become the success stories of tomorrow.
Okay.
Now, Andrew Forrest is somebody who started with nothing in 2003 and has built a successful company. He said that FMG would not be there today if the mining tax had been in place at the time.
Matthias Cormann, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us on The Drum tonight.
Very good to be here.
Finally tonight.